I mean, you could just imagine, in those days, it wasn't, it wasn't that complex a society. But still, what happened really gave me an illustration on how governments and civil society should work. Basically, if there was any problem, let's say somebody is selling drugs or disturbing women or something, all one had to do was go and tell the Ketua Kampung. What would the Ketua Kampung do? He would rally his men. Sadly, again, it's a bit of a misogynistic thing. It's just men. But he would rally his men, and the men would go and solve the problem, and 10 minutes later, they'd be back at their job. So they're not career problem solvers. No. They solve the problem because of their relationship with that society. Then they would probably call the British officer, and the British officer would take away the perps, as it were, and problem solved. So to me, that is civil society at its best. I always remember that story. My grandfather told me when I was like 5 or 6, and I used to think, wow, we didn't need an external organization then. I mean, obviously society is more complex now. But if you listen, here is the definition of civil society. Civil society is composed of the totality of voluntary civic and social organizations and institutions that form the basis of a functioning society. That it is distinct from the force-backed structures of a state. Now, I'm not saying a state is necessarily bad, but a state, if you imagine it, it is on a higher level. It sees only from the top. It does not recognize your problems head on. Yeah, I mean, if you had a political party, they allocated to a particular candidate a seat, that candidate may not even know what the place is like. But civil society is different. Civil society is where the candidate actually comes from that particular area. He actually knows what's going on. He actually knows what kind of issues take place. So this is how I see the MCLM. MCLM is the marriage between politics and civil society. It restores that relationship between you and the parliament. So once you have the parliament is high above, your candidate is there, you can send the candidate and the candidate will express your will. He is not there to represent the party. No, he is there to represent you. That's the difference with this. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Farooq. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us for the MCLM today. We've heard a lot about the sort of MCLM strategy from an independent candidate initiative, but I would just like to talk a little bit more about what civil liberties actually mean and what MCLM hopes to achieve from a civil liberties campaigning point of view. The idea of a Malaysian civil liberties movement was formulated more than 6 years ago now, and it came on the back of a realization that the Malaysian people have unfortunately been systematically stripped of many of their most basic civil liberties and human rights. Malaysians face serious infringements of their basic rights as enshrined within the Malaysian Constitution, also the UN Declaration of Human Rights on an almost daily basis. And I think it's fair to say that actually if we look at what's actually been happening in Malaysia from a socio-political point of view in the last couple of years, things only seem to be getting worse. We hear about regular arrests under the ISA. We hear about people being detained under the ISA for more than 8 years. We hear about students being prevented from participating in the socio-political life of the nation through the UUCA. We hear about cartoonists being thrown in jail for their works. And it really questions and brings into question, are we living in a democratic, open society, or are we living in a autocratic environment in which we are actually afraid to speak and to stand up and to be heard? I also believe that part of the reason why things have sort of spiraled to the point that they are at now is that for too long we've actually ignored the erosion of many of our common core values that are now tearing apart the moral fabric of our society. And hence many of us in MCLM and also in the wider society feel that the time has indeed come to start reclaiming our civil liberties and basic human rights, and reminding the government that in actual fact, governments are elected by their people, and the people also have the right to dismiss them, and they have to take their responsibilities seriously once they get into power. I'd just like to give you a definition of civil liberties according to the Oxford Dictionary of Politics. Basically, civil liberties is defined as those freedoms which are or should be guaranteed to persons to protect an area of non-interference from others, particularly power holders and legal authorities. Civil liberties are especially invoked to limit the justifiable, coercive power of the state. For example, freedom from arbitrary arrest or detention and habeas corpus, freedom of speech, freedom of lawful assembly, freedom of association and of movement, and the right not to incriminate oneself. And I think essentially, if you think about civil liberties and why it's there, in our opinion, it's there to ensure that an individual is able to participate in the civil and political life of the state without discrimination, persecution, or repression, which is a situation which is very different to what we seem to be seeing in Malaysia today. When we contemplate the essence of what civil liberties actually mean, it becomes clear that laws in Malaysia, such as the Internal Security Act, the UUCA, the Press and Printing Act, the Sedition Act, the Police Act, and the Official Secrets Act, amongst many other laws, in Malaysia today, are in actual fact barriers to our right to be free from, as we said earlier in our definition, arbitrary arrest and detention, our right to freedom of speech, our right to lawful assembly, and our right to be free and to move and associate, and so on and so forth. Also disappointingly, despite the Malaysian government sitting on the UN Human Rights Council for more than 2 sittings now, they still refuse to sign a number of major international treaties, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the International Covenant Against Torture. And I think this is important because in the last couple of years, particularly with the government's One Malaysia rebranding strategy and their attempts to really be taken seriously on an international stage, they still refuse to abide by international human rights norms, particularly in the context of civil liberties and human rights. And I think that that's something that as Malaysians, both in Malaysia and abroad, we really need to take a stand on and speak out against. So for me, we've heard a lot about one of the initiatives of the Malaysian Civil Liberties Movement, which is to field independent candidates. But I also feel that we would be doing an injustice to ourselves if we did not explain as well that we want to take the campaigning and the lobbying arm of the MCLM seriously. And basically what we're asking is that we do it through a 3-pronged strategy. So helping people to become more educated and aware of their basic human rights, and we will try and do this in the next year or so through a number of education modules and public lectures and writings that we publish on the internet. We also want to start taking lobbying and campaigning of the government in Malaysia at a government level, but also at an international level, using a number of international human rights instruments. And we want to send them a clear message that we want to see a Malaysia that no longer has arbitrary detention, so we have to abolish the ISA. We need to be living in a Malaysia where we're not going to be afraid of student persecution if students decide to attend political talks or to be seen in organizing. I mean, I don't know if you all kept up to date, but a couple of weeks ago, there were a group of students at Utah University in Kedah who were basically trying to organize a Facebook campaign against the 100-story tower in Malaysia. And they decided that they were going to actually organize a cake-eating protest at McDonald's. And the Chancellor of Utah found out about this and actually banned all students from attending this function at McDonald's. So, I mean, I think this is the level of sort of pettiness and control that the government and the institutions in Malaysia are actually trying to exert over our lives. And I think it's important that people are, educated about their rights to actually say that this sort of behavior is completely unacceptable.